They do not have concerns about Israel's approach to international humanitarian law so far as targeting...
Oh, no.
So
Why? No. That's an extraordinary allegation.
May I finish the question?
All
May I
right,
finish
well,
the answer?
be careful what you're saying. I think that the question that I asked the previous witness, if you don't mind, may I ask you the same one, which is, where do you see Israel in 10 years' time?
It's a very unpredictable region, but based on some key factors, importantly in the last year and a half, the relative victories against a number of Iranian proxies, namely Hezbollah, Hamas, also the Houthis in Yemen, and the imperative that there now seems to be in the international community to deal with, I think, the major threat to Israel, existential threat as some refer to it, Iran. Most of the indications are indeed to the positive, especially when we're looking at that longer-term trajectory of 10 years. And the fact that Israel's economy grew over the last year and a half, despite the unprecedented challenges that this country has been facing, the only democracy in the Middle East, it has been a leading light in many respects, and the prospect also of additional peace accords following the Abraham Accords. I think there's been some discussion of prospects of peace with Saudi Arabia, also on the horizon in previous committee sessions. So those indications are very much to the positive, but that is not to say that there are not significant threats and significant problems, not least with, I'd say the principal one that I'm concerned with is the international legal war against Israel and the weaponization of international law, which poses a significant threat, I should stress.
I'll move on to that in a minute, but I just want to understand what you see as being the future. So your future for Israel is a fairly positive one, the economy doing well, being at peace with its neighbours, dealing with the Iranian threat and the threat from Iranian proxies. That's one side. And so I suppose the other side, given that we're looking at peace for Israel and Palestine, is what would be the future of a Palestinian living in Gaza? What would be the future of a Palestinian living on the West Bank?
I think that ultimately depends on whether the international community continues down the tried and tested mechanism of encouraging extremism, unfortunately, amongst Palestinian terrorist groups. We've seen that vis-à-vis Hamas, we've seen that vis-à-vis Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Fatah, elements of the so-called moderates in the West Bank, until and unless the two driving factors of the worsening situation for the Palestinians, namely indoctrination to terror and incentivization to terror, until those are addressed and until international complicity in those issues and the perpetuation of the conflict through that is addressed. My projection, if you will, or my hopes for a similar positive reality are less optimistic. It's one of the reasons I've made it a significant mission, travelling around the world and meeting with politicians and officials, to stress the importance of ceasing funding for UNRWA, which is at the core...
Wait, sorry, may I just so that I get this. So if I was a Palestinian mother in Gaza or on the West Bank, I would be looking to... my future would be what? It all depends on whether the West are helping to develop extremism within Hamas?
Well, I think the future of any Palestinian in Gaza ultimately depends on whether or not Hamas is defeated, right. Which is, of course, one of Israel's central war aims.
Okay, but you're quite confident that Israel is going to be successful, that Israel is going to defeat Iran and Iranian proxies. So then the question is, what happens then? What does peace look like for Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza? I'm sorry I keep asking, I just want an answer to that.
I think I put it in terms of being cautiously optimistic. I
What does cautiously optimistic mean?
Well, cautiously optimistic, I don't say that it is easy to defeat Iranian threats, in particular where one sees the international community moving to policies of appeasement and complacency in grappling with these threats.
Let's get away from those sorts of words.
Yes.
Let's just talk about what's the future. So you're saying there's a positive future, you're optimistic. So what's the optimistic, positive future for a Palestinian mother in Gaza at the moment or on the West Bank? What's the best thing that could happen?
The best thing that could happen is the ending of the indoctrination and the incentivization to terror, to give ordinary Palestinians a chance. And through that, I think the removal...
What does a chance look like? What does it mean?
Through the removal of the genocidal Islamist regime in Gaza and the corrupt Palestinian Authority.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. What does a chance look like? Let's take away all the words. Let's take away all of those descriptions. Let's keep ourselves calm.
Let me give you a
and just I'm going to have, this is my last try. What does a positive future look like for Palestinians living in Gaza or on the West Bank? What's the best thing we can hope for?
Perhaps I can give you a practical example. When I've visited Ramallah, the biggest cause for optimism I have seen is a visit to a venture capital startup fund looking to create Silicon Valley, a startup culture in the West Bank, in Ramallah, specifically looking to create a Palestinian middle class with a stake in society that can hold its corrupt leadership to account. Mahmoud Abbas, let's not forget, is in the 20th year of his 4-year term. The oppression, the brutal oppression, it's remarkable that there hasn't been more international media attention on the torture that the Palestinian Authority metes out to political opponents in the West Bank. That, if you ask me, and it's reflected in polls across the West Bank by Palestinian organisations, that has ultimately got to be the biggest prospect for the chance that I'm talking about.
Okay, well, the public will have heard your answers to my questions and will decide themselves whether you answered it. John?
Can I come to what you described as one of your missions, which is to combat the weaponisation, I think you said, of international law?
Yes.
I read your speech about the legal basis for settlements in the West Bank, in which you made the case that Israel's borders were set in 1948, and in international law that should still be the position. But you also said that was not the position as determined by the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and most other commentators. Given that, I mean, how can you continue to maintain that in international law Israel is not in breach through settlements in the West Bank?
Because I consider, as a legal professional, my first duty to be to the rule of law and to upholding international law. And one cannot have a general rule, such as uti possidetis juris, which you referenced. This is this customary rule of international law, which is universally applicable as a default rule. And its application to Israel's formation on the 14th of May 1948. I have, in a decade of discussing this with leading academics around the world, I have yet to hear a single reason why it would not apply. We can certainly go into some of the detail of that.
Can I interrupt you, because you set out the argument quite clearly in your speech, and
I'm sorry, I'm not sure which speech you're referring to.
I'm afraid I can't give you the precise date, but anyway,
Yes.
What you're talking about is exactly the case you put at that time, and I understand that. What I don't understand is that almost all international legal bodies take a different view, and why should that be? When you argue that the case in legal terms is very clear.
So, despite about a decade of seeking to get to the bottom of a plausible reason why this would be disapplied, this default rule, to Israel's formation in 1948, I have yet to encounter one. What has been presented so far is essentially predicated on the partition resolution of 1947, which is a General Assembly resolution, and political resolution, not legally binding, which made a recommendation which was never implemented. So that does not, I'm afraid, displace a default rule of customary international law, which has been applied from the 19th century through to the dissolution of the former communist federations, and indeed to any state emerging from a mandate. As to the failure to apply this properly to Israel? Well, it's a matter that was called out by the Vice President of the International Court of Justice, the former Vice President, when she was Vice President, Julia Sebutinde, in her dissenting opinion at the International Court of Justice. This is the recent advisory opinion last year, dealing with issues in the territories. And she not only sets out the application of uti possidetis juris, but makes a scathing critique of the court's approach to general international law, but also to fact-finding. And I think the reason that this isn't more widely acknowledged stems from politics and stems from what we have seen happen in the International Legal Academy and international courts and tribunals. Vis-a-vis the ICC, I'm afraid to say that the crimes, if you will, are far greater, because it is not just uti possidetis juris that is disregarded. It is every basic aspect of international law, including the founding Rome Statute of the court, which is essentially predicated on states joining the court. So this is a court that gets its jurisdiction from state parties that have delegated their jurisdiction to the court. Now, in Israel's case, of course, it is not a state party. The court has proposed to recognise the Palestinian Authority as a state, even though it does not comply with the recognised criteria for statehood under the Montevideo Convention. Then we're faced with a situation where, despite the absence of jurisdiction, because Israel is not a party, despite the absence of jurisdiction because the state of Palestine does not exist in international law, despite the international agreement, I'd say bilateral agreement, which was endorsed by the United Kingdom, the Oslo Accords, which established the Palestinian Authority. The 1995 Oslo Accord makes it explicitly clear that there shall be no criminal jurisdiction over Israelis for the PA. Now, that is an agreement that the International Criminal Court has ridden roughshod over. I know that the Foreign Office had prepared a substantial submission calling the court out on its abuse of jurisdiction. That much is public. What is not clear is why there was a U-turn under this government at the last moment, and that submission was never put forward. The reason I consider that to be particularly troubling is because certainly my understanding is that this was a submission that was made in the national interest of the United Kingdom, keeping the ICC to its proper approach, to its jurisdiction. And again, we see an inexplicable decision that was made, unfortunately, by this government, based, I'm only able to surmise, on politics as opposed to the proper application of law. And it is indeed the same thing. The reason that uti possidetis juris is so critical is that it puts the lie to this allegation of occupation in a legal sense. It puts the lie to this term illegal settlements also. It is, if you will, a warping of international law that has been advanced, most disturbingly, to seek to justify a position that the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, ought to be ethnically cleansed of its Jews. Judenrein, I mean, that may be a term that's familiar to many of the committee members, and that is unfortunately a position that was endorsed by the International Court of Justice.
Can I just cut across you just for a moment? So your position essentially is that since the British mandate was all of the land up to the river in 48, that Israel is the whole of that area as well.
Well, of course, the original mandate was far bigger.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
So let's not go into past history. Let's just try and stick.
Well, the question. It is important because this rule applies to the administrative lines of the mandate. The administrative line that had previously divided Transjordan, what later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, from the rest of the mandate, is the line that ran all the way down along the Jordan River to the Red Sea.
Yes.
And that, under this universal customary rule, that is the only line in play when Israel declares independence.
So that's where I wanted to start, right?
Yes.
So that's your position. Now, the question is, though, it's not the position, because we've not heard from the Israeli government. But it's not the Israeli government's position, is it?
The Israeli government has...
The Israeli government position is not that Israel's borders go from the river, the Jordan River, to the sea, is it?
May I take a moment to answer, because you are skipping through decades of history and policy.
But what I want to do is just because we're missing the Israeli government here, I just want to make sure that I haven't missed something. I mean, it's not the Israeli government's position that Israel begins at the River Jordan and finishes at the Mediterranean Sea, is it?
I'm not here to represent the Israeli government.
No, I just want to make sure that I've got that.
I'm speaking to the application of international law, real international law that is universally
Which the Israeli
applied.
government is not applying.
Well, that's not accurate. And if I may be permitted to answer the question, perhaps the committee will follow the response. What Uti Possidetis Juris does is it tells us the starting point. This is the position in 1948. It is in fact endorsed by all subsequent agreements, the armistice agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan in 1949, and later on also the peace agreements, only refer back to those mandatory lines, administrative lines of the British Mandate. That is significant. What happens in 1967 when Israel recovers the relevant territory, the disputed territory that had previously been under Jordanian occupation? This is the parts of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, is that it treated those territories differently. The Israeli government applied its law, administration and jurisdiction in full to East Jerusalem. And critically, Abba Evan, who was the foreign minister at the time, writes to the UN Secretary General in 1967 and says this is not annexation.
Exactly.
Which is because one cannot annex what is already one's own sovereign territory. So if you're asking, if you're asking me, forgive me, the question was, what is Israel's position? That was Israel's position in 1967. Since then, of course, in pursuit of this land for peace formula, Israel anticipated that peace with Jordan would be achieved by giving Jordan some of the West Bank. So a temporary administration was instituted in Judea and Samaria. Now, that peace with Jordan, when it eventually came along in 1994, didn't include land to Jordan because it no longer wanted anything to do with that territory. So that temporary administration lasted until the Oslo Accords, which I'd already referenced in relation to the absence of ICC jurisdiction. But critically, the Oslo Accords created the Palestinian autonomy in areas A and B, but they did not change the status of the territory, the underlying status of the territory. That has always been a matter that the parties and international backers have agreed was a matter for final status negotiations.
Exactly, so and it is yet to be, and it is so it is not. So your answer is that Israel has not stated that the Israel begins at Jordan and ends at the sea.
Forgive me. Israel does not need to state that, and
well, it doesn't.
You're equating, I'm afraid, two very, very different things here. What is the legal status of the territory? And let me be clear: Uti Possidetis Juris is a default rule that applies automatically, whatever Israel says or not.
Or anyone else in the world says.
Unless
in international law.
Yes, because when the International Court of Justice talked about the emergence of this rule in Burkina Faso, Mali, in the 1980s, it talked about the reasons for its emergence: clean lines, stability, certainty, avoiding fratricidal struggles, all of these issues which uniquely, I would say, it's disapplication here for no reason that can be discerned in international legal analysis, has unfortunately generated all of those issues that the ICJ said this rule had emerged to obviate.
Okay,
now,
hang on, let me just
I just finish the answer to this question, because it's critically important. Israel has not, when it declared independence, it did not reference borders. It simply talked about Eretz Israel. It is not required for Israel to claim that Uti Possidetis Juris arises or applies, and I'm not making a case on or in any way on behalf of the Israeli government. This is simply my analysis as to what the international legal position is, which is, I believe, what I was asked to attend today to provide.
Okay, so can I just stop you there, because there'll be some more questions for you. Abdesam.
Thank you. So I think it's just coming on to the crux of the question that you've answered there. What makes the UN Security Council, the ICC, the ICJ, all the esteemed lawyers there in their advisory positions, every British government since 1967, pretty much every international legal authority, they've all stated that the settlements in the occupied territories are legal, and yet your position is different. What makes you better than all of these other lawyers that we've heard from, who perhaps, in your view, don't understand real international law. What makes your position? Why should we hear your position as different and unique to theirs?
I've never suggested that I'm in any way better, but until and unless I am presented with an argument that makes it clear that this is the wrong application of international law, as opposed to what the UN and what these international courts and tribunals have consistently done, with some exceptions, I'm minded to say. There was the dissent that I mentioned from Sebutinde. In relation to the ICC, in fact, in 2021, there was also a very powerful dissent by Judge Kovacs. So I would...
Can I intervene here? Natasha, do you agree then that the occupations are not legal? The annexation is not legal, yes or no?
No, it's not a yes or no, because one cannot annex what is one's own sovereign territory. So the term annexation is misplaced here. Likewise, the term occupation, because when Israel recovered that territory... Let me give you a parallel example, which I know members of the committee will be familiar with. Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine's borders were settled by uti possidetis iuris. If Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia, in the same way that Israel recovered the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and East Jerusalem from Jordan.
That's assuming that Israel owns that piece of land to start off with.
Well, yes, but I'm saying the same rules have to apply.
Can I come on to a different question, Natasha?
May I just finish the answer?
And I've got a different question.
The same rules have to apply.
Quite limited on time, I'm so sorry.
5 minutes until the next speaker. So, on Palestinian recognition and whether they are entitled to a state, simple yes-no question. Do you believe that the Palestinians are entitled to a state?
Self-determination does not give one a right to a state in international law.
That's a no.
But would you like to understand why?
I'd like to know from you whether Natasha Hausdorff believes that the Palestinians have the right to a state.
I have explained that the Palestinians already have self-determination and an autonomy.
Not self-determination.
There is no... The right to a state is not according to international law.
That's a no. Thank you.
If the building also, let's say there are people in it, there are terrorist operatives and there are civilians. In that instance, would the IDF be entitled to target that building?
That depends on another very important aspect of international humanitarian law, which is the rule of proportionality. Now, it's probably worth taking a moment to explain what it is, because it's perhaps the most misrepresented element of international humanitarian law.
I mean, we've got somebody else who's going to ask about that business about proportionality being about the military objective rather than about it being somehow to do with equivalent deaths on both sides. Of course, that is a very misrepresented principle of international humanitarian law. But I want to focus on distinction. If there are civilians in the building, the IDF targets that building, you've established that might be a violation of the IHL principle of distinction.
You cannot separate the two, I'm afraid. Distinction, proportionality, precaution, and necessity all work together. So if the target in that building is necessary to advance the military objectives of the fighting force, if they have identified terrorist operatives there, then the next two factors to consider are the first, which is proportionality. And that is about, as you correctly indicate, weighing up the importance of that military objective against the anticipated civilian collateral damage on the basis of intelligence that is available. That is not an effects-based assessment, that is a intent-based assessment. But the other aspect of this, the fourth principle, which is critical, is precaution. And this is something that Israel does do on a scale, I'm afraid, I have to say, never before seen, because other modern armies aren't in a position to issue the sorts of warnings and the evacuation measures that Israel has taken with respect to this urban armed conflict.
So perhaps we could then take an example. I mean, the sort of precaution that you talk about is the tapping on the roof before ordnance.
Knock-on roof is one of the
distinctive elements of this particular conflict. Could we use an example of the destruction of the Al Yarmouk neighbourhood 12-storey residential building in October 2023? The target of the strike was Hamas terrorist tunnel underneath the building. The building was 12 stories tall and it resulted in the death of 81 women and children. Was, in that instance, international humanitarian law applied? Did we see here the principle of distinction used?
You are asking me about one particular incident in the last year and a half, which I'd be very happy to look into. Certainly I would have done if there'd been any advance warning, but off the top of my head, I'm certainly not in a position to say one way or the other. And may I be clear, neither are any international commentators who purport to give a decided answer on that, and there's a very straightforward reason for it. The only way that a proper analysis of your question can be conducted is if the information that was available to the operatives that undertook that strike in advance of conducting it can be properly assessed. We simply don't know what that is because it is not in the public domain. But I would say that the two entities I'm aware of that Israel has shared elements of sensitive intelligence of this nature with, the UK government and the US government, have consistently said they do not have concerns about Israel's approach to international humanitarian law so far as targeting...
Oh, no.
So
why? No. That's an extraordinary allegation.
May I finish the question?
All
may
right,
I finish
well,
the answer?
Be careful what you're saying.
I beg your pardon.
I
beg your pardon. No, I've come here in good faith to answer questions, and from the moment I walked in the room, I've been barracked and told to be quiet when I've been trying to answer questions. I will answer this one with your permission.
Please answer this question accurately,
yes,
and with care.
The UK and the US have consistently said that so far as targeting and proportionality, which is what your question pertains to, yes, there are not concerns. There have been other concerns raised on the basis of incorrect information. If we have time to discuss detention and aid, we certainly can. But even the United Kingdom, and I'm afraid the Foreign Secretary has had to walk back some unfortunate remarks in the past, but so far as targeting and proportionality is concerned, there have not been concerns raised on the contrary.
Why is it, therefore, that Britain is not selling arms to Israel that can be used in Gaza? Is it not on the basis that there is a risk of a breach of humanitarian law?
I might ask this committee to look into that very question, because there is no nexus between the concerns that this government has raised on detention and aid and the arms that have been embargoed. There is a very great concern I have that absent a nexus, because of the absence of concerns on proportionality and targeting, that is not a decision that can in fact be lawful. And it is one that has clearly upended the licensing regulations in this country, which certainly has impacts quite outside of the scope of this committee's inquiry, but that are very significant to the UK's ability to export arms confidently to other countries. So this is what I mean about playing fast and loose with real law. It creates very problematic precedents in other respects, and the decision on the embargo is a deeply, deeply troubling one because of this absence of nexus. It is in fact, the Foreign Office has made it very clear in its advice where it's, in its public statements on this, where its concerns lie. And they are nothing to do with the arms that have been embargoed, which must ultimately be for political reasons rather than legal ones.
I would like to ask about international humanitarian law again and aid deliveries. So 91% of people in Gaza are facing food insecurity. 1/3 of hospitals there are completely out of action, with the other 2/3 damaged already by the fighting. 92% of housing units have been destroyed or damaged. And it's now 50 days that no aid deliveries have been accepted into Gaza. And in fact, Israeli ministers have declared they are blocking aid, in particular to exert pressure on Hamas. This is, from my opinion, and almost every aid agency in the world, a clear breach of international humanitarian law. I wonder how you think Israel is justifying this.
As far as the aid issue is concerned, the statistics on this, I'm afraid, have been consistently misrepresented. So far, across the operation period of, this is before the ceasefire, there was 1.1% of trucks that came from the international community to aid crossing points that Israel refused to allow into Gaza. That was it, because they were either dual-use items or because the aid organisation in question didn't allow a search to be conducted. Now, those searches...
It's about the current blockade, not what...
Well, let's be clear, because the reports that you referred to were also erroneous, and in fact many of them predicting famine in Gaza, and that have been used to justify the false accusations of starvation as a weapon of war.
Given how little time we have, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could
this
just
does
answer
require
Alex's
a full
question.
answer, I'm afraid.
Answer the question that you've been asked, if you don't mind, given that we are already running over time.
Right.
You've been asked specifically about aid not getting in at the moment, and you're talking about another period of time, which is in itself contentious, and we don't have time to get into that argument. What we're asking, the question that you were asked was very precise and carefully put, and I would greatly appreciate it in the few moments that we have left if you could answer it.
The question I was asked referenced reports of international bodies which have erroneously predicted famine and starvation in Gaza. And in fact, I link in our submission to your report separately we have done on those aid reports and on the famine review that we've conducted, which I would ask the committee to consider, because the IPC report in particular was called out by the Famine Review Committee as being based on only impartial information and being implausible in its predictions. Now, that is significant to answer your question on what aid organisations have reported. Those allegations, I'm afraid, are false, and you only need to look at the volume of aid that has gone in.
Are the blockade in place at the moment?
I'll come to that in a moment, if I will. There were several parts to your question. One only has to look at the volume of aid that has gone in, which is publicly available on COGAT statistics on their website, and the subsequent analysis of the calorific content of that aid, which in the 7 months that were analysed, January to July last year, found that over 3,000 calories per person per day had gone into Gaza, which is significantly in excess of NHS guidelines. That is the position before going into the ceasefire. As part of the ceasefire, aid was flooded into the Gaza Strip, so that even international humanitarian organisations have agreed that there were many, many months of aid available in the Gaza Strip, so that the subsequent seizure of aid going in as part of an attempt to put pressure on Hamas. Let me be clear. Hamas has been stealing the aid, selling it on the black market, and using those funds to fuel its war machine against Israel. So that is the reason for the aid being turned off, on the basis that the civilian population have sufficient because of the flooding of Gaza with humanitarian aid over the course of the ceasefire. I hope that answers your question.
So your position is, despite the UN's reports that over 90% of people in Gaza face food insecurity last week, it's acceptable to conduct this blockade because there was lots of aid delivered in the past.
So the UN reports, and that's why it's important that I address them, have been consistently found to be wrong. And I ask you to look at the numbers, the data that has gone in, and the analysis of the calorific content. If there are indeed individuals facing food insecurity in Gaza, then there is a very clear reason for that, and that is Hamas's diversion of aid, because the total volume that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip by Israel is far in excess of what is required by individual Gazans. Hamas has been stealing the aid, but also I mentioned they were shooting civilians. That includes shooting civilians that were seeking to obtain some of that aid that was being brought in by international organisations.